Hey Titans, this is Mordecai from GamerTitan.com. In this video, we're going to go over how to set up this basic UI, which allows us, or allows the player, to click a button on a UI and have something happen on the server. So when I click this boat, my character starts to fly. As you can see in the background here, I'm flying now. I'll open the panel again, I'll click the walk icon or button, and my character will fall down to the ground. One other thing we'll cover is we'll cover how to also do client-side button actions, such as if I wanted to close this panel, I just click the X and it closes. We'll go through several things. At the end of this video, you should have a really good understanding of how to use buttons in Core to be able to allow your players to do some very cool things in your games. Enjoy. So as a quick recap, in the last video, we made a UI panel where the player could press T and it would open the panel. It would also allow, when the panel is open, for the player to use their mouse. Now currently we have it set up where if the player presses T again, it will close. So the first thing we can do is we can actually make a button, like a X button to close in the top right corner, which is in fact, it will be a UI button. And when they click it as another option, it will close the UI. Because sometimes it may not always be that obvious that you would have to press T again to close the panel. So it's always good to give players several different options, and usually you want to make those options as logical as possible, something that they're familiar with. So the first thing we're going to want to do is under the GamerTitan Toggle UI tutorial. Now, once again, if you haven't downloaded this from CC, you can either download the GamerTitan Toggle UI tutorial. So as an example, if you type in GamerTitan, under community content is this UI toggle tutorial. If you download this one, it will start you at the beginning of the video. I will also upload to community content what we will end up finishing and building. So you can also download that if you want the entire finished product. So when we have the GamerTitan Toggle UI tutorial, we have underneath the folder, under the client context, underneath the UI container, we have this parent panel. What we'll want to do is click on it, and we will want to change the visibility from force off to force on. Now we are able to actually edit the panel. So what we're going to do now is we're going to add our button. So to do this, go to core content. Under game objects is UI elements, and what we're going to want to use is the UI button core object. So we'll go and simply drag this under the background panel for now, and it will automatically go to the bottom, which means it's in the foreground. And so what we'll want to do is we will want to change its anchor and its dock from top left to top right. So we'll change both of those to top right. And we will also, because it's going to be an X button, we will want it to be a perfect square. So what we could do is we'll make it 75 width and 75 height simply by typing in those values. And that looks pretty decent. The other thing to note is we want to go ahead and change the image. So what we could do is we could double click image here. And for X buttons or close buttons, I usually use crosshair 0 to 1. So if we click on that, we now have a cross. And so to actually make it an X, all we have to do is change the rotation angle 45 degrees. And now because we changed the rotation angle, we will need to offset it, I believe by 40-ish pixels, probably a bit more. We can eyeball it. We'll probably want to do the offset to try and make it so the button is in fact in the panel. And while that doesn't look perfect, this will get the job done. So now we have this UI button. So what we'll want to do is we'll want to rename it from UI button to something like close button. And now in our script, which is the UI underscore example client context, we'll want to click on the script, and we will want to drag the close button into as a custom property. It'll make this box green. That way we have an object reference that we can tell the script that this button exists. So now what we'll do is we'll copy the object reference and we will open the script. Close a few things here. And so now I copied the new object reference that we added. So what we can do is simply paste it in, and now we have this new custom property, which is close button, and it is close button right here. So what we can do now is, because we can reference this button, one of the events that we can attach to a button object is the clicked event. So how to do that is clicked event dot connect, and then the function, what will be called when this event is called. So we could do on button clicked as an example. And inside of on button clicked, I'll put it right here, we can do function on button click. Sorry, I kept saying clicked, but I actually did click. And the function, the event listener, will pass in automatically to us this parameter called button. And so we can attach this event listener, this clicked event, to multiple different buttons. And I'll make this a bit larger for you guys. We can attach this same clicked event to multiple buttons, and what that allows us to do is it tells us, okay, this button was pressed. And so if for whatever reason we were connecting this event listener to several buttons, one way to verify that it is the button we're looking for is we could do if button equals the close button. And that would allow us to have this function have multiple buttons. And so now what we want to do is, if you noticed before, we had set up this toggle UI function. And that's why it is important to separate things into other functions that do, like, for example, this toggle UI, it does exactly what it says. If you turn it to true, it'll toggle the UI to be visible. If you pass it false, it will turn it off. And because we already set up that function, all we have to do is copy this one. And when this button, this close button, is clicked, it'll toggle the UI to false. So it will no longer be visible. So now if we go ahead and save this script and we go back into our hierarchy and go to parent panel and change the visibility from force on to force off, I believe it was, we'll press preview mode. And if I press T, it still opens the panel, and I can still press T to close it. So if you see, I'm pressing T to open and close it. But now, if we did our code correctly, I should be able to hover my mouse over this X button, click it, and have it close. Now, if everything works properly, I can press T again, and it'll open. So that is the basics of a button. So there's a few things I want to discuss in terms of how to actually understand how to use buttons more in depth. Because one thing when I first started was I didn't know how to be able to pass information into a button. And what I mean by that is, with this function, it passes the button, but if there was any information that I wanted to tie to that button, how would I know what that information is? So one of those things that I like to use, because this is a client script, and I'm just going to use this as an example, you can attach as much information as you want to each object in core. And on the client, we can use client user data, and then it's a table which is attached to the object. So for example, I could name it string, and then I could pass test. And what this will do is it is now attached to the close button. So if I use the same client user data and I do a print, but I change this close button to button, we'll be able to print out test. And the reason for this is once again, this information is actually attached to the button object itself. And this is valuable for when you have multiple buttons or multiple things attached to the same event listener. So for example, if you were wanting to pass a equipment ID or something like that, this is one way I would set it up. It basically makes sure that all the information associated with that button is stored in the button object itself. So just to test that this is in fact working, what we'll do is go to preview, I'll toggle it, I'll click the X button, and we should get test. And as you see in the event log here, it printed test. And just to recap here, the button that we're actually printing the client user data of, while it still is close button, we actually passed in the button parameter here. So we could do this with multiple buttons. So what we'll do, just as a quick test, is we'll make one more button. So we'll do force on. We'll just make another quick button. We're going to delete this one, so it doesn't matter too much. We'll just put it in the middle, and we'll just make it button 2. And same thing, I'm going to drag button 2 into the UI example script so I can get the object reference of it. I'm going to open the script. I'm going to reference it up at the top. So now it's called button 2. Going to go down here. I'm going to connect the exact same event listener. And what we'll do is we'll make the client user data string equal button 2. So without changing anything else, by clicking button 2, because we're doing this check here in the function of on button click, button will not equal close button, so it won't toggle the UI to false. However, because of this print, it's outside of that if, it will in fact print the string, which should be button 2. We'll go ahead and change the visibility back to false on the parent panel. We'll click preview, and if I click this white box here, it should say button 2. As you can see, it's printing it out. And but it's not doing anything, it's just printing. And if I click the X button, it closes and prints test. So that is how you connect the same listener and be able to do things based on different buttons. So I'll go ahead and delete this test information here. And we will even delete the button 2 object from the script. We will turn the visibility back on real quick. Oops. Which you don't really need to do. All we're doing is deleting this button. And so, sorry to jump all over, but what I'll do is I'll go back and force the visibility to back off. We'll open the script again. So now the next question likely will be, okay, so this is how you use a button when it is in a client context, doing something that is in fact client context. I delete this listener as well. So if you're wanting something to happen on the server, you will need to use events. And luckily, a client can send 10 events per second to the server. So if we wanted to give the player a resource or something, or anything that is server validated, we would have to actually send it to the server when this button is clicked. So I guess we shouldn't have actually deleted that second button. So let me just go ahead and put these back in real quick. So we're still going to use the second button, but this time what we're going to do is we're going to make button 2 do something. So we'll figure that out in just a second. Let me just add button 2 back to this real quick. So now button 2 is back. So there's a few things we could do with the player. I guess what we could do is we can make them fly. So what we'll need is we will need a server context first. So we're going to make a server context. And the reason we need this is because, well, you could have it in normal context as well. I like to use server context for this type of stuff. And what we'll do is we'll just call it UI server script. And so what we do is we'll put the new script that we created in server context. And what we're going to do is first create a event listener, events.connect per player. And I always, if you're not familiar with events, go to script helper. If you type in event or broadcast, we will do broadcast to the server on the client script. So to show this, we first will want to do if button equals button 2, then do that. And then for the events broadcast to server, we'll just call it button 2. Now, if you're not familiar with events, I did film a video explaining this, but we'll just do this very quickly. So all we need to do is broadcast to the server that button 2 is clicked. Now the thing to note here is because right now, if this is all we did, this would be client validated, meaning that if you wanted to have something such as like the player click a button and purchase something, you would likely want to put a check on both the client and the server, meaning making sure that the client, first of all, has enough currency, say, has enough gold to actually purchase that weapon, and you would check it on the client, but you would also want to do that on the server. And the reason for that is because if it's client-side validated, it could, in the future, players could actually hack the client side. It's not something you need to worry about too much, but it's just good to know. It's good practice to do. So what we're doing is when button equals button 2, it will do a broadcast to the server that button 2 was clicked. And then on the server script, we need to do connect for player, and script helper is just a savior for this. So what we'll do is do events connect for player, and once again we need to pass in the event name that it's listening for, and that was button 2. So just going back to verify, this needs to be the exact same thing on both sides because it is what it's listening for. So it's button 2, and then this is the function that it'll call on button click. So now what we do is, because it's connecting for player, the first parameter that's passed to this is on button click will be the player. So what we can do now is we could do activate flying, is what I think we were wanting to do. So activate flying. So all we would do is pass the player and do that. So now this example, well, a quick example, we are checking this on button click. We made button 2, which is just that white box in the middle of the panel. When button 2 equals when button equals button 2, it does this event to broadcast to server that button 2 is clicked. On the server side, it's listening, it's connecting for player, it's listening for button 2. And when you do connect for player, the first parameter that's passed is in fact the player. And when button 2, the server says, hey, the client just sent me button 2, it will fire this function on button click, passes the player, and it will activate flying. So what we'll do is we'll go back to the parent panel, we'll set the visibility to false, we'll click play, and as you can see, I can't fly right now. So if I toggle, I click the button, I now am flying. Now the problem is we didn't set it up to allow the player to start walking again. So now that we're flying, we're just flying forever. So that at least is working. That's a quick example on how to get information from the client to the server. So if we wanted, we could obviously make this look a bit better, make it look slightly more informative in terms of what will happen when they click it. So I will just make a button, see if we have anything for flying. Not really familiar with the artwork as much as the artists are. So we'll just make it just for quickness, just to do this quickly, we'll just make it a boat. So the boat will be when they fly. Offset it by 50, maybe 100. We'll make a new button called button 3, and we should probably rename this to flying button. We'll name this one walking, and we'll change its offset to 100. We'll change its image so we can recognize it, and we'll just use this icon for player walking. We're going to do the same thing. We're going to go ahead and open up our UI example client script. We're going to spell walking correctly. And we're going to reference this new button. We're going to copy it. We're going to paste it up here. We're going to go ahead and add this listener. And we're going to do the same thing once again. We're going to do if button equals walking, then let's name it button 3. Usually you want to name your broadcasts, you know, I would name it walk. Something like that. Just so you know what it is supposed to be doing. And even that's not a great naming convention, but it'll get the job done. So we're going to go to the server. We're going to do the same thing. And actually we could pass a parameter instead. We'll pass it to true. And we'll pass false. Actually, we could use the same listener. Sorry for jumping all over the place. But basically what's happening is instead of making a totally new listener, which is an option, we'll use the same listener, but we're going to pass a new parameter. And this new parameter will be, if it's true, they should start flying. If it's false, they shouldn't be flying, so they should go back to the walking state. So we'll go ahead and save this. And now we could use this same thing, but now we have this new boolean that we're passing. So what we could do is if bool, then activate flying, else, is it activate walking? I'm not sure what the walking one is. Let's find out. Activate walking. All right. So else we'll do activate walking. And I'll do a recap again. We'll format this so it looks a bit cleaner. So what's happening is on the UI, the actual client, which once again, this is fully client validated, the button pressed, if it's 2, it passes true, which means that we're going to make them start flying. If the button is walking, it's going to pass false. So the server should get that as this new parameter called bool. If true, then it'll activate flying, else it'll activate walking. So let's go ahead and give it a try. So we're going to go back to the project. We're going to go to the parent panel, force the visibility back off, preview. We're going to press T. We're going to click the sail. We should be able to fly. Now while I'm flying, if I click the walking icon, I should fall because I'm back to walking. Do it again. So there you have it. So one other thing I want to mention is when I first started in Core and I started understanding UI, this is one way to do it in terms of doing all these references one by one. There's a few other ways to do it. You can either make all these buttons a reference of the parent panel, or another option is if we turn this back on. Now, if you recall, I'm a big fan of using panels to separate various things. So we'll make a new panel. We're going to put it in the center. And we'll call it buttons. And we're going to make it slightly larger. And we're going to put the flying button and the walking button under the buttons panel. We're going to leave the close button because that one's kind of separate, but we could put it under there as well. And what we'll do now, as opposed to having to reference every single button, say that we wanted a ton of buttons here, instead of having to reference every single button in the script individually, what we could do is now that we have this buttons panel, we can actually just reference the buttons panel itself. We can remove the walking and we can remove button 2. And so there's a few differences here. What we're going to do is we're going to delete these. We're going to do buttons. And when the script first starts, so when the script first starts, it's getting this buttons panel. and we're going to use what's called get children. So at the beginning, we can loop through all the children, and I'll explain this, but we're passing in buttons, and we're going to do get children. Do. And instead of doing it that way, we just pass in button. And we'll format this, we'll move it down. So what's happening is when the script first loads, because this is outside of a function, we have this object reference to buttons, and all of its children are buttons. So what we're doing is we're doing a loop, and it's going to get every single child, and it's then going to connect this onClick event. So we're passing in button, which is each child of buttons. Now, one thing this does is it's actually going to mess up our checks here, or at least for right here. And that's because we no longer directly referenced the button. And so we can't check against it because we don't have a direct reference to it currently. So another option we have is we could do a custom property on the button itself. So as an example, we can make a Boolean, and we can call it should fly. And on walking, it will be false. We'll do the same to the flying button. So we'll make a Boolean, it needs to be the same name, should fly, to true. And we'll set that one to true. The other thing is we have a few options. We can either check the button based on its name, or we could actually add some form of indicator to realize, to understand what this button is. And so what we'll do is we'll just make it a string. And we'll call it button group. And so what we're going to do is button group will be the same for these two buttons, and we'll just name it player change as just an example. And so what this is going to allow us to do is, because both of these buttons have these custom properties and we're looping through them, what we can do is get these custom properties. We're going to go to our UI example script, and in this for loop, the reason I wanted to do this was because it's one way to show that client user data that I was talking about. So what we're going to do is, instead of script, the actual custom properties on the button itself. So all we have to do is pass in button here. So the bool is if it should make them fly or not. The button group will be how we'll indicate it. So what we're going to do is we're going to do button dot client user data dot button group, and instead of passing it to a variable directly, first we'll just go ahead and pass it to button group. The other one is we'll do bool, and we'll do that. So once again, it's looping through at the start of the script. It's getting all the buttons that are a child of the buttons panel. It's connecting this listener to the on button click event for each button. We now have this information about the button itself based on the custom properties of the button, and we're passing it through the client user data. And so what we can do now is, instead of this if button equals, we first would do if button group, and I forget what we named it. Just real quick, player change. And if I'm losing you, I will try and go back and explain it. And then what we're going to do is we have the button bool. And so now we just pass this directly. And so what's happening once more is we are getting all this information from the custom properties. We're passing it in as client user data of the button itself. Because once again, when button is passed, we don't know what button it is, but we can still get information about it if we set it up when we're actually connecting this listener and stuff. So the button will pass the client user data, and it will pass it for the Boolean as well. So if the client user data of the button is button group and it equals player change, then it will do this event to broadcast it to the server. The button will also have the Boolean, which we probably should put some checks because it's possible that this doesn't exist and it would always return false, which in this case is probably fine. But what we'll do is we will put a check on this. We're checking that it exists. So if it's true and it exists, then it equals that. The only reason I would do that is if we had multiple things in the table, but I guess we don't even need that either. I'm kind of overcomplicating things at the moment. So to stay focused here, this all should work the same, but if you notice, it's actually easier because we could add as many buttons as we want. We would just have to modify the server-side script, because on the client side, if we had these different properties, we could add more to them to do different things instead of having to reference every new button up here. So we'll go back to the parent panel. We'll go to visibility force off. We'll press preview, press T, and now if I fly, same thing happens. Press walk, same thing happens. And so what this allows us to do, once again, is it just allows us to add more buttons and have the options on the buttons itself. Now I know this is a very basic example because we only have flying, should fly, or shouldn't fly, but the information here is the same. We can actually attach a lot of information and custom properties on the button. There's other ways to do it, but this is the easiest way to kind of portray a lot easier, more clean code in terms of connecting buttons, as opposed to having thousands potentially of objects being referenced here up at the top. So hopefully that was helpful. I know this get children thing might have been a little bit more advanced. Perhaps it should have been its own video, but the results are the same. All you have to do is get the button object, make sure that it's referenced somewhere in your script, regardless if you use this wait for object and reference it up at the top, or if you want to do a lot more buttons and want to set things up so it's a bit quicker for you, I would recommend putting all your buttons underneath a single panel, which allows you to then loop through them and just connect them that way. And then you can use custom properties on the button itself. Now, one thing I will note is because this is a custom property, some of you probably have already figured this out, you don't even need to use the client user data, and that's because the actual button is still passed here. And so one other example, and the only reason I did this was because I was trying to show an example of the client user data, but another thing to know here is we could just do should fly equals button right there without ever connecting this, and then we would do that. So we could delete these, and it's because, once again, we still have the object reference to the button, so we can get its custom properties whenever we want. And so we could do this. We can make sure that button group equals the player change, and we could pass should fly here as another option. And so this will work just the same because we're not caching it into the client user data. We're getting the custom property. And once again, the button, this button has these custom properties. We're saving them as variables, and we're doing the same thing. So just to confirm this isn't working, this is working. Once again, oops, had it off, turned it on, should have been off. We'll press T, click the boat, we're flying around, click this, we fall to the ground. So that should cover the basics of buttons. I know this was a lot to cover, and like I said, I know the get children thing is a bit more advanced. We're using for loops and stuff like that, but I want to teach you the basic version to do it, and then also kind of give you a feel for how to start to think about how to structure your code to actually make it so this is more scalable. So as a great example, like if we didn't have a Boolean, we could have an ID system. And based on that ID, we could then have multiple things happening. So for example, say we wanted to allow them to fly, we wanted to allow them to walk, we wanted to have a button that would speed up their max walk speed. Instead of using a simple Boolean, we could pass IDs. And so ID 1, as an example, could be walking. ID 2 could be flying. ID 3 could increase their walk speed. ID 4 could lower their walk speed. And then on the server side, we just have to remember that if, you know, whatever this is, int equals 1, activate walking in this case. If int equals 2, activate flying. And I believe I said increase and decrease their walk speed. That's just some things to consider. It's really dependent on what you're wanting to do. And as I said, this is currently all client-side validated. So as an example, if we were trying to check a player resource, I once again would make sure, say that you wanted to charge 100 gold to allow them to fly. You would want to check the player resource and make sure that they have enough money, enough gold, to be able to even click the button. So you'd want to validate it on this side. So just to give you an example, we have this local player, and this code isn't actually going to work in terms of currently because we didn't set up any resources. But just to give you the example, so we get the current player's gold, and we would do and current gold is greater than or equal to whatever the cost was that we wanted to associate with it, and say we just did 100 gold. Now the same thing is true right here, that we just did this check. We would want to do it on the server as well. And so to just copy this over to the server, we'd want to do the exact same thing. The difference is we'd have to check the player. And so if current gold is greater than or equal to 100, then we would do this. And by doing it twice, this allows two things. First of all, if they don't have enough gold, it doesn't even make sense to send the broadcast to the server. But on the server, we want to make sure that they do in fact have enough gold. And so this is one thing I would suggest, is doing the checks on both sides, because if they don't have enough gold, it wouldn't do this broadcast. And so even if someone spammed something, it wouldn't send a bunch of broadcasts to the server in this case. If they ran out of gold, it would stop sending it. You could do other checks as well. It really depends on what you want to do. But once again, this video could continue. I'm going to try and splice these up into even more videos and continue explaining this stuff. So hopefully this video was helpful. If you liked this content, please hit that thumbs up. It really does help me. If you liked the video, or if you have any questions or comments, please do so in the comments down below. And once again, if you're not a subscriber yet, I would greatly appreciate if you hit that subscribe button, because I will be continuing to film core related content, mostly tutorials in scripting and game creation, from what I have learned over almost a year now of being a core creator. So once again, thank you for watching. Hopefully it was helpful, and I'll catch you next time, Titans.